Yes, it is a beautiful day here in sunny Tampa, Florida, and I hope all is well where you're at as well. Hello, and welcome everyone. This is episode number 99. Wow, episode 99. It just seems crazy that when I started this podcast way back on July 29th in 2020, during the height and hysteria of COVID, that I would keep on doing this thing for so long, with some minor life happens breaks along the way. But hey, here we are. I appreciate you listening in. Oh, and let me give a shout out and thank you to the city of Los Angeles, California. This city represents the most popular location of my podcast. And so I just want to say I appreciate you for listening in from the city of Angels. But since I'm giving some recognition, the state of Iowa, my home state, actually. I've lived in Florida for a very long time now, but Iowa represents the place I get the most downloads as a state in. And I know I have friends and family who listen in there, but with the sheer number of downloads, I know my friends and family do not want to hear me talk all that much. So anyway, anyone and everyone who's listening in from Iowa, thank you as well for listening. So if you're here for the first time, or you listen in every week for a dose of moral, ethical, wisdom insights from the greatest minds to ever walk the earth and put pen to paper, well, this week we're transitioning away from the ancient spirit, the ancient period. You know, we've spent a lot of time on the Greeks, everyone from Socrates to Aristotle and Plato to the Stoics to the Cynics to the Epicurus to Jesus Christ, and finally wrapping up with the Desert Fathers and Mothers last week. But now we're transitioning to a new era. Today, we begin our analysis of the medieval time period. Now, when I was in college, even all the way through graduate school, this time in history was often called the Dark Ages. But now in recent history, we've pretty much dropped that term altogether because it just wasn't accurate. There was an incredible amount of scholarship, a incredible amount of new ideas, new ways of looking at life and the world that were anything but lacking depth and innovation and complexity. I can't wait to get into the topic today, and it's ignorance and how ignorance is breeding evil and division in this country and really globally. And we're going to do this after we connect the dots and we look at the medieval era in the Jewish tradition. But okay, let's just set the stage before I go historical backwards into our text for the day. But let's look at our moral and ethical analysis, just some of the things that are going on today. I'm going to give two examples. Here's ignorant example number one. Defund the police. It was a rallying cry back during the days of George Floyd, especially. But where did it come from? Mainly from white, elite college, Washington, D.C. political types, ideologues, or at least college-educated people living in gated communities to push out a set of luxury beliefs on how to handle high crime in dangerous communities in which they will never enter, let alone live in. And as usual, the ones that suffer from this horrible idea and continue to suffer from high crime, murder, robbery, etc., are not the people at the New York Times that were pushing this stupidity, but rather it came from the upper middle class, mainly white, mainly wealthy people screaming for it. And who suffered the most? The poor, as usual. Is there police brutality? Of course. It's well documented. Is reform needed? Of course. Plus training and pay structures of the police force and evaluation and et cetera, but to remove the people that are there to protect and serve the public, especially the most vulnerable in our public, completely, and even dream or insinuate in some way, shape, or form that the people in the most vulnerable, the most high crime areas will start sharing cookies and cream and milk on the street because the cops are gone and everyone will live in harmony, well, that is ignorant. But let's be fair. The conservatives, the hard right, they're not innocent by any stretch at all either. They're just as guilty, if not more. Let's look at one conservative state. And I ran across this. Someone sent this to me, and I appreciate it. And a very conservative, quote-unquote, idea. Well, I guess I'll call it an idea loosely. Here's ignorant example number 2. A headline to an article read, quote, Mississippi passes bill restricting electric car dealerships, end quote. Oh, geez, where do I begin? So a rallying cry of the far right is don't go environmentally woke. So let's just do something and ban electric car dealerships so nobody can own an electric car. Even though supposedly, allegedly, a conservative believes and fights for free markets. But instead we're just going to restrict a free market thing. It's so basic, so common to the American culture as car driving. So let's restrict that and not let someone buy the type of car they want. But we're going to combat the left environmental movement. Yeah, that's going to work. Just because, you shouldn't want to buy an electric car, that means you're woke. Come on now. How silly. Does the environmental movement go a bit crazy sometimes? Yeah. I mean, how many doomsday clocks from Al Gore have expired by now? 3, 4 of them? How many times have I heard Florida is going to fall into the oceans in a decade? Yet the very, very wealthy continue to buy up beachfront properties at higher and higher prices. How many times do I have to hear the oceans are going to boil and the world will end? Yet, is the climate changing? Of course it is. Is it a problem? Yeah, it sure appears so. Change is always a problem and always needs to be addressed. But could we drop the end of the world porn as well as the climate denial lingo and in Mississippi that you can't even drive an EV in our state? That's just utter silliness and ignorance. So today we're going to address ignorance. What it is, why it's so dangerous, and how to fight it. And we're going to analyze ignorance by looking back in time through the very important medieval lens and the Jewish tradition. But now, let's back up a bit. Let's back up and set the stage before we go racing to our postmodern world. As in our study of wisdom literature, we get some profound and relevant teachings from a Jewish rabbi, philosopher, and theologian. His name was Maimonides, and that is going to teach us about ignorance today and how to combat it. So, we left the ancient world last week, and now we sit here in episode 99 in the medieval period, and we're going to hang out here for a number of weeks. And this period is most importantly and usually associated with the slow and the painful breakup of the Roman Empire, which cemented an age of monotheistic religious belief across Europe and the Middle East. This replaced that Roman dominance. As we look at the ideas, philosophies, and the moral teachings, we begin to see a very explicit focus on the conduct of individuals that was carried out within the confines and the parameters of different religious and cultural traditions. The wise person in this era followed the will of God as it was taught. Whether the text is Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, God was at the forefront, maybe stronger than at any other era in human history. Because from this point, it's going to kind of start to wane and start to morph and change. But, okay. Now, right here for 1 minute, I know what the non-religious or the atheist might be thinking right now, and hopefully you're still here and you didn't already stop the podcast, and you might be thinking, oh, here we go, religion, Christian or Muslim preaching to me with their false God, moralizing that I'm going to hell, and if I don't conduct my life that in the way of the Christian, the Jewish, the Muslim text, then I'm damned for eternity. But just consider this. Understanding of each other and of all moral and ethical teachings is required if and only if you want to become an intellectually strong and wise person. Studying Christianity, Judaism, or Islam doesn't mean that you will become one or someone's preaching it to you necessarily, but it does help you to understand them. Later in our march through history, I would hope and expect that the religious-minded listening right now will equally want to understand and study and appreciate the opinions and philosophies of the atheist as well, and some of their worldviews. Not that someone of faith will abandon their faith and become an atheist, but that they will understand and appreciate people who don't think like them. This seems like an obvious thing, but somehow, in some way, we have gotten lost in our society that our first inclination is to shut down, turn off, talk over, or scream and yell versus attempt to understand. And I hope here we don't go that route, but rather we attempt to understand. This is so important in society, and we need millions and millions, heck, even billions of people to take up that intellectual task. Okay, let me step off my soapbox now and let's get back to it. In Rome, at the end of the classical period, as it was slowly dying, Stoicism was maybe the one philosophy, which we already talked about, and it was so influential that it continued to hold on for maybe about 500 years until it was finally supplanted by Christianity. In fact, when we look back at all those amazing philosophical schools that rose from the Greeks that we've talked about during the Hellenistic period, classical Greece, pretty much all of them were supplanted by different Christian thinkers, or they were given a new Christian form that was acceptable to the Roman Catholic Church. Yet in history, these great wisdom texts, they don't just disappear like the snap of a finger. They hang around. They take on new forms. They mold in new ways, and they do show up in many of the ideas in the different religious traditions. And if you read deeply, which I hope you will do by going to the Substack page and reading some of those texts, you're going to see them. Now, in the medieval period, really the focus that we will read in this section is on 3 different faiths. All of them monotheistic. All of them took form under the same one God of the Abrahamic tradition. Religious thinkers during the medieval period accepted the role of revelation, of divine wisdom that was passed down to them from a metaphysical God who stood on high, and they received this wisdom from a spiritual, supernatural being, and it was through these revelations to humans that we are told how we should live and how we should act, especially when we get to Islam and we see the Prophet Muhammad. There's maybe the newest version of this divine inspiration, and humans bring forth this knowledge. A quick segue here. We will eventually get into a period in history where the ethical, moral, and wisdom, it's not going to come from a supernatural being anymore, because there is no supernatural being to pass down any moral and ethical rules to live by. Or in the minimum, the supernatural being, if one happens to believe in one, doesn't care enough about humanity to intervene. But we're not there yet. In the medieval period, God provides the ethical and moral framework that we're going to be reading about. And it's through these wisdom texts of the Middle Ages that through God, we're going to need them to live our best life, or our most ethical life, and our most moral life, according to the medieval doctrines. But these spiritual leaders, academics and writers, let's not kid ourselves. They were well aware of the philosophical tradition of the classic age. And the medieval thinkers developed their own ethical beliefs from a combination of different ethical systems within the God-centered moral framework that was provided by their own religious doctrine. This always fascinates me, how as we've been studying wisdom literature, I think you're starting to sense a common theme of ways to live or ways to act, pitfalls to avoid. As it seems, we talk a lot about the same themes. No matter what time period that we talk about, I mean, is it that the human brain is just limited? Or could it be there is just some embedded universal truths in humanity about how to live life that regardless of whether you were living in 5000 BCE or 4 BCE or 2023, that all of us can just take to the bank certain ethical rules as the right way to live life? I don't know. It's for you to discover on your own. But one thing is for certain. In this section, the medieval age, whether we are talking about Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, or Thomas Aquinas, all of them reconciled ancient elements of the Aristotelian and the Greek tradition with their religious, theological sources. I think one common theme that we're going to see in the medieval period is a turning to the idea of personal salvation. This is an important shift, as it's vital to the religions of the Abrahamic tradition, because this brings about a heightened individualism and responsibility and an internalization of the components of good and evil that replace the fatalism of earlier views. Now, you might say, what do you mean prior eras were fatalistic? I thought the Greeks were pretty progressive and pretty positive, and they brought about a sense of personal responsibility. Well, in many ways, that is definitely 100% true, and we talked about a lot of that when we were, especially Stoicism and some of the other ideas of Socrates. But in one very key area, the Greeks were, when you think about it, pretty fatalistic. And it's a very important area. Think of the gods. The gods of Greece, for example. They were all powerful. But they were prejudiced. They were emotional. Heck, they displayed human emotions of jealousy, rage, and passion. And one day they might choose one person that undeservingly is heaped with huge blessings and then turn around and torture, kill, or just humiliate another human for no particular reason beyond maybe they felt disrespected or preferred to worship some other god over them because they were a rival. I mean, to the Greeks, humans were, for the most part, completely at the indiscriminate mercy of their gods. They didn't have any personal responsibility or ability to reach heaven or nirvana on their own. The gods controlled literally everything, and it seemed arbitrary often and very luck of the drawish. And when you read, say, a Greek tragedy, for example, you can really get a sense of that. And along comes Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and they bring forth this idea of individual personal responsibility. That the decisions that we make in life and the actions that we do will impact where we end up at death. God is in control, yes, of course, and completely in control, but here's the kicker. You and I have what's known as free will to choose. We are told the right way to live life, but nobody's forcing us to do it. We will choose or not to follow the moral and ethical guidelines, and we'll make it to heaven or not because we choose to ignore the precepts and teachings and end up in hell. God doesn't decide. To the medieval mindset, you and I decide by our thoughts and our actions and the way we live life. This is very, very different from the ancient Greek system. The thinkers of the time supported the idea that you and I, that all humans literally can directly experience a higher spiritual order. There was a popular belief that the active renunciation of material things, for example, provides us with an ethical framework that puts us in touch with and even allows us to live within a transcendent world. This is just one example, but there are many, many more components to the moral and ethical system. So the medieval period and a focus on heightened individualism that, oh, by the way, will take individualism to an entirely different level as we march through history and we move beyond religion into some philosophies and moral structures devoid of God. But for now, let's dive into our first study in the medieval period, the Jewish tradition. We're going to begin with the Jewish tradition. It's only fair that it starts here because from the Jewish tradition, we get the Christian tradition, and then we get the final of the Abrahamic traditions with Islam. So Judaism, world's oldest monotheistic religion, dates all the way back 4,000 years. Followers of Judaism believe in one God who revealed himself through the ancient prophets. The history of Judaism is essential to understanding the Jewish faith, which has a rich heritage of law and culture and tradition. Jewish people believe there's only one God. This was new. This was unique. Polytheism and multi-gods were everywhere in the region, in the world. But this one God concept, he established a covenant, a special agreement with the people. The Jews' God communicates to believers through prophets and rewards good deeds while also punishing evil. Most Jews, with the exception of just a few groups, believe that their Messiah, spoken about in the Old Testament, hasn't come yet, but he will one day, and this is the break with Christianity. As to the Christians, the Messiah has already come, and he died for the sins of humanity on the cross in the form of Jesus Christ. The last break from Judaism of the three Abrahamic religions will be Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad arrives and declares himself the final prophet. But make no mistake, the three faiths come from the Abrahamic tradition. Today, there's about 14 million Jews all around the world. Most of them live in the United States and Israel. Traditionally, a person is considered Jewish if his or her mother is Jewish. The Jewish sacred text is called the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. It includes the same books as the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, but they're placed in a little different order. No big deal there. The origins of the Jewish faith are explained throughout the Torah. According to texts, God revealed himself to a Hebrew man. His name was Abraham, who became known as the founder of Judaism. Jews believe that God made a special covenant with Abraham and that he and his descendants were chosen people who would create a great, grand nation. Abraham's son, Isaac, and his grandson, Jacob, also became central figures in ancient Jewish history. Jacob took the name Israel, and his children and future generations became known as the Israelites. More than 1,000 years after Abraham, the prophet Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt after being enslaved for hundreds and hundreds of years. According to scriptures, God revealed his laws, known as the 10 Commandments, to Moses at Mount Sinai. We're not going to recoup the entire history of Judaism. If you're Christian and you've read the Old Testament, you're pretty darn familiar with it. If not, and you really want to know the history of the Jews, for sure dive into its fascinating, amazing history to read. But today, we aren't picking up from the ancient texts. We're going to pick up, though, from an incredibly influential Jewish rabbi of the medieval period. He was a rabbi, a physician, a theologian, a philosopher who lived in what's now known as present-day Morocco and Egypt. He lived from the years 1138 to 1204, and his name was Maimonides in the Greek version of his name. And sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, but hey, you get the idea. And we're just going to go with that one. His influence on the thoughts and ethics and wisdom of the Middle Ages can't be underestimated. And so he is going to be the focus. So let's explore the life and philosophies of this incredible man. Maimonides was born into a very affluent family in Spain, actually, where he studied the Torah under his father, who was a rabbinic scholar and a judge. And it was here that he developed a very keen interest in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy at an early age. One really unique thing that we see in these incredibly intellectual people, and we should take this to heart, and we should maybe try and mimic a little bit of this, is that they just have a diverse curiosity to understand multiple disciplines. One of the worst things that happen in the West and in education in general is at the university level, we know more and more about less and less. But back in the day of Maimonides, we see these great intellectual thinkers that have an incredible depth of knowledge across so many disciplines. But anyway, he moved on to cosmopolitan Christian, Islamic, and Jewish circles. That's kind of where he hung out. So he read across the Greek philosophers in Arabic translations and summaries. And he also read all the Christian sources, and he was naturally familiar with the rabbinical sources of his time. Maimonides was active in the affairs of the Jewish community his entire life, and he played a pretty prominent role in the purchasing of Jews who had been taken captive during the Crusades, and even became the leader of the Jewish community in Egypt around 1171. At 50, later in life, he married into a really influential family with connections to the government. And we know he had at least one son. But life was not easy for Maimonides, as it never is for anyone. But his brother, David, drowned at sea on a business trip to India. And the entire family's fortune was lost. So he was forced to turn to the practice of medicine. And eventually he was appointed the physician to a sultan in the royal family. Obviously, again, showing his prowess intellectually and skill-wise. His medical practice brought him in contact with the elites throughout society. And in addition to his work in theology and philosophy, he wrote extensively on medical matters as well. So you can see he had a pretty darn busy public life. And he was also just an industrious scholar. And, that's something that we need to consider. We can all have careers, but that doesn't mean we have to stop pursuing intellectual things such as reading or writing. Maimonides kind of shows this. And, this is why we're actually talking about him today. He wrote a major ethical work in the year 1180. It was 14 volumes deep and contained a systematic commentary on the 613 precepts of the Jewish law believed to be divinely received by Moses, and all of them contained in the Torah. This book was called Mikna Torah and provides a highly logical synthesis of the law and the entire rabbinic tradition, organized in a very straightforward and user-friendly fashion. Maimonides, fascinated by the faith, wrote and the basic principles of the faith of Judaism. And he wrote a work called The 13 Principles of Faith, which are still actually recited in synagogues today. But the work that we focus on in this episode is called The Guide for the Perplexed. What an awesome title for a book. The Guide for the Perplexed. He wrote it in 1186, and in this work, he turns his attention to an intellectual Jewish audience who still might be confused or bewildered about the ambiguous and figurative expressions in the holy writings. I mean, for people that are new to any faith, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, when you read those ancient texts, I mean, it can be overwhelming. The allegories, the symbolism, all that stuff, it can just go right over the top of your head. And so Maimonides thought, well, I'm going to write something up and I'm going to explain this. When we look at a faith like Judaism, Judaism over 4,000 years old, or at least at the time when Maimonides was writing, it was over 1,000 years old, and it can be hard without brilliant scholars, without brilliant minds, to sometimes interpret and explain the meaning. Maimonides stepped into this very complex, very controversial area of writing. He argued often about just a literal interpretation of Scripture, and he viewed religion kind of as a path to truths that can be discovered by the human mind, either through philosophy or symbols or figures of speech and stories of the religious tradition. There's a very strong Greek philosophical perspective in the guide, while still trying to stay true to the Jewish tradition like we talked about earlier in the episode. I guess if there's one overriding force that seems to stand out to me anyways, it's probably the idea that the moral life is best lived in a life of contemplation. We just don't stop and think. We just don't slow down and consider things deeply. Everything's so quick and fast. Amazon delivery in less than 24 hours. Get on the web, search something, you expect a search result in less than a quarter of a second. And we just don't slow down. And Maimonides saw the study of metaphysics as almost like a holy endeavor. Reading and studying and learning was akin to a form of worship. And he describes the philosophical life in very religious terms when you read his works, as kind of the perfect intellectual worship of God. There's even a discussion among scholars concerning the relation between philosophy and revealed religion in his work. The other ideal way to live life, or a moral life that seems to stand out, as he would call it, would be a life of active charitable service. This comes up all the time, and we've already talked about this across many, many great minds. In Maimonides, he argues we should cultivate dynamic moral virtues that imitate the kindness and forgiveness and service of God. The fully moral person will have a loving kindness, be righteous, not pass judgment flippantly or without moral cause. That aligns with Scripture. These virtues are essentially selfless acts, and they mimic the divine. But I have everything that I've been reading from this guide for the guide for the perplexed. What stands out to me the most is his imploring of the reader to study and learn. And although he is clearly captivated and loves the rational and the philosophic tradition, this is obvious in his writings. However, he does see very clearly limits to human knowledge and reasoning. And he even says that must be learned as well, that we don't know everything. It's really easy in our postmodern world is guilty. Well, the postmodern world is very, very guilty of thinking they can figure everything out on their own. And Maimonides believes the highest intellectual and highest spiritual experience is reserved only for the prophets, or in the minimum, can only be achieved within the framework of religion, which recognizes the supernatural dominance of God. So this is the context of our reading. And I'm only going to read you today one very short chapter and discuss it. And I chose what I think is especially relevant to you and I and culture today. I'm always amazed when I read these ancient texts, and somehow, some way, I can almost always make a connection to my own life and the culture that we're living today. It really fascinates me. How the heck did they do that? How did they even have a clue? Well, they go deep, and I think that's probably why we call them wisdom literature. But let's get to it. So I'm going to read to you chapter 11 from part 3 of the Guide for the Perplexed. And here it goes. Quote, "Evil comes from the absence of wisdom. All the great evils which have been caused to each other because of certain intentions, desires, opinions, or religious principles are likewise due to the non-existence, because they originate in ignorance, which is the absence of wisdom. A blind man, for example, who has no guide, stumbles constantly because he cannot see, and causes injury and harm to himself and others. In the same manner, various classes of men, each man in proportion to his ignorance, bring great evils upon themselves and upon other individual members of the species. If men possess wisdom, which stands in the same relation to the form of man as the sight to the eye, they would not cause any injury to themselves or to others. For the knowledge of truth removes hatred and quarrels and prevents mutual injuries. This state of society is promised to us by the prophet in the words, quote, 'And the wolf shall dwell with the lamb,' end quote. The prophet also points out what will be the cause of this change. For he says that hatred, quarrel, and fighting will come to an end because men will then have a true knowledge of God." Man, I love this idea that ignorance breeds evil, violence, and divisiveness. Ignorance breeds evil, violence, divisiveness, not only in the individual, but in the entire society. The cause is ignorance. Wow. I think we see this everywhere today. I know I need to calm myself down all the time when I hear something or I see something that I don't agree with, and I try to educate myself fully so that I can understand things and not let my ignorance cause me to make rash or rush judgments. I think our ignorance abounds. I think it's easy to see it. I think it's causing horrific division amongst people in society today. You know, I was reading the other day, for example, they're the nonpartisan, you've probably heard of the Pew Research Center, awesome group, recently surveyed people in 17 different countries across Europe, Asia, and North America. And sadly, Americans were the most likely to say their society was split along partisan, racial, and ethnic lines. The U.S. also reported more religious division than almost any other country surveyed. The U.S. was also one of 5 countries in which more than half the public said their fellow citizens can't even agree on basic common facts. Those other countries, by the way, if you happen to be in one of them, besides the U.S., were France, Spain, Italy, and Belgium. And these countries are more divided than before the virus hit. In the U.S., 88% of Americans say they can't agree on basic facts. Is that crazy or what? Overall, the level of political division that Americans report, 90% say they see strong or very strong conflict between supporters of different political parties. That's crazy high. The average level of perceived strong political conflict across the other 17 countries averaged out 50%. We are way off the charts here in the United States. That's bad news. That's sad. That's embarrassing. A large number of people see politics in the United States of America in apocalyptic terms. And they view the opposite party not just as competition, but as a threat to their very life and survival of the nation. Here's a thought. With the ideological extremism that exists in culture today, and this extremism is fed to us by a corporate media trying to give a very specific spin on everything to a very specific audience that they can sell advertisements to, social media algorithms that make certain that we only see videos, read articles, and gain exposure to ideas that we agree on so we're all happy and we always feel like we're in the majority and in the right. These things are making us, how shall I say it, dumber and dumber every single day. What Maimonides is telling us is so much of the strife and the evil and the anger that we have in our society today is the fact that we are ignorant. We're closed-minded. We don't consider or appreciate any opinion or idea that doesn't align with our own thought process. This is very dangerous. And it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for me. Hopefully it's embarrassing to you if you live in the United States or if you live in a country that is highly divided, that's the way things are at right now. But ignorance, we got to get rid of ignorance. So what comes to mind of the number one thing to do? Education. So our education, yours and mine, according to Maimonides, it's not about some rote intellectual pursuit to make money or to get a job, but learning and studying and philosophizing on metaphysical ideas, or in the minimum, deep thinking, cultural, personal, ethical, and moral constructs like we talk about in this podcast. And if ideally, to Maimonides, they also point upwards to God, to a higher power that you and I can intuit, or what's a better word that we can ponder and we can think about and we can vaguely understand. But you and I will never be a God. So the best we can do is learn and study and think and live our actions as close to God as possible. This is the highest order. This is the best education. You know, we have such a shallow view of being educated in our postmodern world. Far too many students and parents consider, quote unquote, education as attending an institution. And why do we do it? Well, because we need to obtain a piece of paper called a diploma. Why? Well, because that piece of paper is a passport of sorts to a job so that we can make money. This is not true education. It's a transaction. It's a technicality. It's a barrier that we as a society have put in place, and we give titles: associate degree, bachelor degree, a master's degree, ooh, ah, or the vaunted doctoral degree, double, ooh, ah. But Maimonides and pretty much every great wise person of the time says being educated and being wise has nothing to do with institutional degrees or titles or money, and it has everything to do with learning and exploring and discovering things. The intellectual pushing of boundaries to a higher level. This is what true education is all about. This is and can lead to intellectual freedom. Sadly, I hate to say it so bluntly, as it's embarrassing for me too. I mean, I've worked in higher ed my entire life almost, but there's a kind of a cult of ignorance in the United States. And it's always been there. You know, the two-party political system surely is a problem. And they established the public education system, designed more to keep kids in line and program them to fit in nicely into the machine. And then as kids move from class to class, from grade to grade, from kindergarten all the way through high school, and once they go through all the hurdles, they gain a piece of paper. It's called a high school diploma. They march on to college. And again, they move through a rigid system of rote objective knowledge, for the most part, until they earn the college diploma. And then, and only then, can they become a well-compensated and productive worker bee in the throngs of middle-class worker bees. This model's terribly broken. If Maimonides saw it, he would be aghast at it, because it creates a sort of anti-intellectualism, where education means getting pieces of paper so that you can make money, and instead it shuns kind of a deep pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. And so this model of papers equal money equals jobs, it's been kind of a constant thread. And it's kind of wound through our political and our cultural life. And the American dream kind of nurtures that. And it's kind of these false promises are out there. And of course, the two-party political system, they don't help with the ignorance. And the media is anything but honest information brokers. And that doesn't help now. And now in our social media landscape of the postmodern world, we see an astounding amount of evil and narcissistic banter and trolling that breeds hate, division, and anger even further. And of course, the algorithms love to amplify that stuff because it gets a whole lot of attention. So all of a sudden, everybody on both sides, the left and the right, they see the entire world as an extreme view. But if only we could throw off these shackles of ignorance, and if we could just disentangle from it, then maybe we can kind of stem the tide and reject the likes of these ideological extremists, the overt racists, and all of the end of the world porn peddlers, whether they come in the form of elected officials or environmental snake oil salesmen or anything in between. Ignorance is the breeding ground for so much that ails our society. We love to not take personal responsibility for it, but I think when Maimonides says ignorance is the breeding ground for evil and division, he hit it on the head. The medieval Jewish tradition implores us to educate ourselves. Maimonides implores us. I love the way he writes, and he speaks directly to us in those writings. To educate ourselves, to escape the dangers of this ignorance. Maybe it's time we listen. We can do this. We need to read deeply. Withhold judgment until we understand things. Realize that the world on nearly every issue is complex and nuanced. It's not so simple as politicians try and make it out to be. We need to develop some humility so we stop pretending we have everything figured out. And when we're wrong, we need to admit we're wrong. We need to learn to ask sincere questions. And here's a big one: to listen. Listen more than we speak. And respect other people and their opinions. I know I need to work on every single one of these, and none of them are easy. But if I can do it, I know you can do it, and all of us can do it. All right, I think that covers our friend Maimonides' ignorance and the medieval Jewish tradition well enough for one day, and at least this gives you just a little flavor and a little something to think about. But by all means, check out the show notes. Go to the Intellectual Freedom Substack page, subscribe, and read for yourself some of the great works of Maimonides. They're free. It's 100% free. Also come back for episode 100 as we analyze the teachings of St. Augustine. He was a prolific writer, scholar, philosopher, theologian, pound for pound, arguably maybe one of the most intellectual of the Christian figures we would study. And he had a crazy, fascinating life too that I can't wait to discuss with you. So with that, everyone, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we will talk again soon. Take care.